The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Henderson's military surplus in Richmond, Virginia. Tom Mitchell, a 52-year-old Marine Corps veteran with graying temples and weathered hands, walked slowly past rows of decommissioned equipment. His limp, a permanent reminder of his service in Iraq, became more pronounced as fatigue set in. He wasn't looking for anything in particular that Saturday in March. He just needed to get out of his cramped apartment, away from the bills piling up on his kitchen table and the silence that had filled his home since his divorce 2 years earlier. Tom had been working as a security guard at a shopping mall for the past 3 years, a far cry from the purpose and camaraderie he'd felt during his 20 years in the military. The transition to civilian life had been harder than he'd ever imagined. His daughter, Sarah, was in her second year at Virginia Commonwealth University, and between her tuition and his modest salary, Tom was barely keeping his head above water. He stopped in front of an old military Jeep, its olive green paint faded and peeling, rust creeping along the wheel wells. A handwritten sign taped to the windshield read, 1971 M151 Mu-T, as is, $400. Tom ran his hand along the hood, feeling the warmth of the metal under the afternoon sun. Something about the vehicle called to him, perhaps a connection to his past, to a time when life had made more sense. Jerry Henderson, the owner, emerged from the office, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. He was a Vietnam veteran himself, in his early 70s, with a full head of white hair and kind eyes behind thick glasses. She's been sitting here for about 8 months, Jerry said, approaching Tom. Came from an estate sale over in Fredericksburg. Original owner passed away, and his kids just wanted it gone. Runs, though. Engine's solid. Just needs some cosmetic work and probably new brakes. Tom pulled out his wallet and counted the worn bills inside. He had $600 until his next paycheck, money he'd been saving for Sarah's birthday next month. Would you take $300? Tom asked, knowing he was pushing his luck. Jerry studied him for a moment, recognizing something in Tom's eyes. Perhaps a reflection of his own struggles after returning from war. Tell you what, Jerry said. $400, but I'll throw in a full tune-up and help you get her road ready. You served, didn't you? Marines, 20 years. Then we've got a deal, brother. If you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life stories. It really helps us continue bringing you this content. 2 weeks later, Tom had the Jeep running smoothly. He'd spend his evenings after work in Jerry's garage, the two veterans bonding over wrenches and war stories. The physical work felt good, purposeful in a way his job at the mall never did. He'd even managed to patch up most of the rust and apply a fresh coat of paint, bringing some of the old military vehicle's dignity back. It was a rainy Saturday morning in April when Tom decided to give the Jeep a thorough cleaning. The interior hadn't been touched since he'd bought it, and the smell of mildew and old canvas filled the cab. He removed the seats, vacuumed decades of dirt and debris, and scrubbed down every surface. As he worked on removing the passenger seat completely to clean underneath, his fingers brushed against something wedged between the seat frame and the floor. He pulled out a weathered leather portfolio, its corners worn and the strap barely holding together. Inside, he found a collection of documents, service records from the early 1970s, some old photographs of soldiers in Vietnam, and a hand-drawn map. The map was detailed, drawn on military-grade paper that had yellowed with age. It showed a section of rural Virginia with landmarks Tom recognized from his own time stationed at Quantico. There were annotations in faded blue ink, distances, coordinates, and at one location marked with an X, a note that read, Cache Point, November 1972, for safekeeping until end of service. Tom sat in the Jeep as rain drummed on the roof, studying the map under the dome light. His military training kicked in, and he could read the coordinates clearly. The location was about 40 miles west, near the Blue Ridge Mountains, on what appeared to be private property. Over the next few days, Tom couldn't stop thinking about the map. He tried to research the Jeep's original owner through Jerry, who dug up the estate sale documents. The name was Lieutenant Colonel James Hartley, who had passed away at age 78. Jerry gave Tom the phone number for Hartley's daughter, Patricia Morrison. Tom called on a Tuesday evening, his heart pounding. Patricia answered on the third ring, her voice cautious when he explained who he was and how he'd obtained her father's Jeep. I found some personal items, Tom said carefully. Service records, photographs, and what appears to be a map. I wanted to return them to you if you'd like. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. My father never talked much about his service, Patricia said quietly. He kept a lot to himself. What kind of map? Tom described it, including the coordinates and the cryptic note. Patricia's voice changed, becoming more interested. I need to see this, she said. Can we meet? They arranged to meet at a coffee shop in Fredericksburg the following Saturday. Patricia arrived with her husband, David, a thoughtful-looking man in his 50s who worked as an accountant. She was in her early 50s, with her father's same penetrating eyes, and she carried herself with a certain formality that suggested military roots. Tom spread the map on the table between them, along with the photographs and service records. Patricia's hands trembled slightly as she picked up a photo of her father, young and smiling in his uniform, standing with 3 other soldiers in front of a helicopter. "I've never seen this picture," she said softly. "He looks so happy." "The map," David interjected gently. "What do you think it means?" Patricia studied it carefully. "My father was part of a special operations unit in Vietnam. After he returned, he was assigned to logistics at Quantico for several years before retiring in 1985. He was very private about his work." She looked up at Tom. "He used to take solo camping trips out near the Blue Ridge Mountains when I was young. My mother said it was his way of dealing with his memories." "Do you want to investigate this?" Tom asked. "I'm happy to help." Patricia exchanged a look with her husband. "I think we need to, for my father's sake. Whatever he hid, he had his reasons." They agreed to meet the following weekend, giving David time to research property records for the area marked on the map. The coordinates pointed to a section of land that had been part of a larger private estate in the 1970s, but had since been divided and sold. The specific location now belonged to an elderly couple who lived in North Carolina and only used the property for hunting a few times a year. David managed to contact them and explain that they were trying to resolve some historical questions related to a deceased veteran. The owners, sympathetic to their cause, gave permission for them to access the property with the condition that they document anything they found. The drive out to the Blue Ridge Mountains took them through winding country roads lined with budding spring trees. Tom drove the old Jeep, with Patricia and David following in their sedan. The closer they got to the coordinates, the more remote the landscape became. They turned off the main highway onto a gravel road, then onto an even narrower dirt path that climbed into the foothills. According to the map, they needed to hike about half a mile from where the road ended. Tom, despite his bad leg, led the way with Patricia and David following. The terrain was rough, covered in decades of fallen leaves and overgrown vegetation. They passed through a dense section of oak and pine trees, the canopy overhead filtering the afternoon sunlight into scattered beams. "It should be near that rock formation," Tom said, pointing to a distinctive outcropping of gray stone that matched a sketch on the margin of the map. They spread out, searching the area carefully. David used a metal detector he'd borrowed from a friend, sweeping it slowly across the ground. After 20 minutes, the detector began beeping insistently near the base of a large oak tree. Tom knelt down and began clearing away layers of leaves and soil. About a foot down, his fingers hit something solid and metallic. His heart raced as he dug more carefully, revealing the edge of a military-grade storage container, the kind used to protect sensitive equipment from moisture and damage. With David's help, they pulled the container from the ground. It was about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, secured with a rusted padlock. Tom used bolt cutters from his toolkit to break the lock, and they slowly opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in protective oilcloth, were multiple sealed plastic bags. The first bag contained documents, detailed logs, photographs, and what appeared to be intelligence reports from Vietnam operations. But it was the second and third bags that made them all freeze. Stacks of currency, neatly bundled and wrapped, filled most of the container. But these weren't modern bills. They were rare notes from various periods, including Confederate currency, early 20th century gold certificates, and a collection of coins that gleamed despite decades underground. "My God," Patricia whispered. "What was he doing?" Tom carefully examined the documents while David photographed everything with his phone. Among the papers was a letter, written in the same hand that had created the map. Tom read it aloud. "To whoever finds this, I was part of a recovery operation in 1971, tasked with securing assets from a private collection in Southeast Asia. What we found were items of historical significance that had been stolen during the war. I couldn't leave them to be lost or destroyed, but I also couldn't justify turning them over through proper channels given the chaos of that time. I've spent my career protecting these items, waiting for the right moment to ensure they're preserved properly. If you found this, I'm likely gone. Please see that these find their way to institutions that can appreciate their historical value." It was signed Lieutenant Colonel James Hartley and dated November 1972. Over the next 3 months, Tom, Patricia, and David worked with historians, numismatists, and legal experts to authenticate and evaluate the collection. The rare currency and coins were genuine, some of them extremely rare specimens that had been thought lost. There were also historical documents related to Civil War financing and early American banking that proved invaluable to researchers. The total appraised value came to approximately $52 million. The legal process was complex. Since the items had been buried on private property, the current landowners were entitled to a significant portion under Virginia treasure trove law. But they were gracious people who, after learning the full story, agreed to take only 10%, wanting the bulk to go to Patricia and to Tom, who had made the discovery possible. After legal fees, taxes, and the landowner's share, Patricia insisted on splitting everything equally with Tom. She said her father would have wanted it that way, that he'd clearly trusted whoever found his map to do the right thing. "You could have kept this to yourself," Patricia said when they met to sign the final papers. "You could have gone out there alone and no one would have known." Tom shook his head. "That's not who I am, and I don't think that's what your father would have wanted." The money changed Tom's life in ways both large and small. He immediately paid off Sarah's tuition for the remaining 2 years of her education and set up a trust fund for her future. He bought a modest house with a garage where he could work on vehicles, something he discovered he genuinely enjoyed during his time fixing up the Jeep. But more importantly, Tom used a significant portion of his share to establish a foundation to help veterans transition to civilian life. He partnered with local organizations to provide job training, mental health support, and financial counseling, all services he wished he'd had access to when he'd first left the military. Jerry Henderson's military surplus became the foundation's headquarters, and Jerry signed on as a volunteer coordinator. Together, they created a program where veterans could learn mechanical skills while restoring military vehicles, which were then sold to support the foundation's operations. Tom quit his job at the mall and devoted himself full-time to the foundation. For the first time since leaving the Marines, he felt that sense of purpose return. He wasn't just helping himself, he was helping others who were struggling with the same challenges he'd faced. Sarah graduated with honors and decided to pursue a master's degree in social work, inspired by her father's work with veterans. Their relationship, which had been strained during the difficult years after the divorce, grew stronger than ever. Patricia Morrison used her portion of the inheritance to write a biography of her father, filling in the gaps of his life story with the help of the documents they'd found. The book, titled The Lieutenant Colonel's Cash, became a modest success and helped bring attention to the often overlooked stories of veterans who served quietly and carried their burdens privately. 1 year after the discovery, Tom stood in the garage of his new home, looking at the old Jeep. He'd been offered substantial sums for it by collectors, but he couldn't bring himself to sell. The vehicle had given him more than money. It had given him back his purpose. He thought about the chain of unlikely events that had led him to that parking lot on that particular Saturday. If he'd gone home instead of stopping at Jerry's place, if he'd negotiated the price down to $300 and Jerry had refused, if he'd never cleaned under that seat. Tom didn't believe in fate or destiny in any mystical sense, but he did believe in the way lives intersect, and how small acts of kindness and honor can ripple outward in unexpected ways. Lieutenant Colonel Hartley had protected those historical artifacts for decades, trusting that whoever found them would do the right thing. Tom had honored that trust, and in doing so had found a way to honor himself and his service. The foundation had already helped over 200 veterans in its first year. Men and women found jobs, received counseling, reconnected with a sense of community. Every time Tom met with another veteran and saw that same lost look in their eyes that he'd once had, he understood a little better what Hartley's final message had really meant. It wasn't just about the money or the historical artifacts. It was about trust, about believing that people would do the right thing when given the chance. It was about understanding that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It just takes different forms. On a warm evening in September, Tom hosted a barbecue at his house for Foundation volunteers and the veterans they'd helped. Sarah was there, along with Jerry, Patricia, and David. As the sun set and people shared stories and laughter, Tom found himself standing by the Jeep, running his hand along its hood, just as he had the first day. Patricia walked over to join him. "You know, I've been thinking about what my father wrote in that letter, about waiting for the right moment to ensure everything was preserved properly." "What about it?" Tom asked. "I think you were the right moment," Patricia said. "Not just because you found the map, but because of what you chose to do with it. He couldn't have known who would find his cash, but somehow the right person did." Tom looked at the people gathered in his yard, veterans finding their way back to purpose, finding community and support. He thought about all the small decisions that had led to this moment, all the unlikely coincidences that had to align perfectly. "Maybe," Tom said quietly, "or maybe we all just got lucky." "I prefer to think it was something more than luck," Patricia replied. "I think it was honor recognizing honor." As darkness fell and the stars began to emerge above the Blue Ridge Mountains, Tom realized that he'd found something more valuable than money in that old military Jeep. He'd found a way back to himself, a reminder that the values he'd carried in service, duty, honor, integrity, could still guide him in civilian life. The Jeep sat in his garage, no longer a symbol of what he'd lost, but a reminder of what he'd found. And somewhere, Tom liked to think that Lieutenant Colonel James Hartley would have been pleased to know that his final act of service had created ripples of hope and purpose for so many others. The foundation continued to grow, helping more veterans each year. Tom never forgot the lesson that $400 and an old map had taught him, that sometimes the most valuable discoveries aren't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the communities we build. That real wealth comes from giving others the same opportunities and second chances that we've been fortunate enough to receive. The weeks following the legal settlement had been overwhelming for Tom. He'd never imagined having access to such wealth, and the responsibility of it weighed heavily on his shoulders. He spent countless sleepless nights in his old apartment, staring at the ceiling, trying to process how his life had changed so dramatically. Sarah had been the first person he'd called after the final papers were signed. She'd been studying in the library when her phone rang, and when Tom told her the news, she'd started crying. Not tears of joy about the money, but tears of relief that her father, who had struggled for so long, would finally have some peace. "Dad, you deserve this," she'd said through her tears. "You've always put everyone else first. For once, something good happened to you." But Tom didn't see it that way. He saw Lieutenant Colonel Hartley, a man he'd never met but felt deeply connected to, a man who had carried a burden for decades, who had protected something valuable, not for personal gain, but because it was the right thing to do. Tom felt obligated to honor that same principle. The house he purchased was a modest 3-bedroom colonial in a quiet neighborhood of Richmond, built in the 1950s with solid bones, but in need of updates. The garage, however, was spacious and well lit, perfect for his new passion. He spent weeks setting it up with proper tools, a lift system, and workbenches. The old military Jeep took pride of place in the center. One afternoon in late October, as Tom was organizing his new workspace, he heard a knock on the garage door. He looked up to find a man in his early 30s, thin and nervous-looking, with a Marine Corps tattoo visible on his forearm. "Can I help you?" Tom asked, wiping grease from his hands. "Are you Tom Mitchell, the guy who runs the Veterans Foundation?" The young man shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable. "That's me. What's your name, Marine?" "Marcus Webb. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. Got out 6 months ago." Marcus looked down at his feet. "I've been staying at the shelter downtown. Someone there told me about your program, said you might be able to help." Tom set down his tools and gave Marcus his full attention. He saw himself in this young man, that lost expression, that uncertainty about where to go next. "Come inside," Tom said. "Let's talk." Over coffee in Tom's kitchen, Marcus opened up about his struggles. He'd been a vehicle mechanic in the Marines, good at his job, but civilian employers wanted certifications he didn't have. He'd applied to dozens of places, but without a permanent address or reliable transportation, getting hired seemed impossible. His savings had run out, and he was living day to day. "I'm not looking for a handout," Marcus said quickly. "I just need a chance. Someone told me you teach mechanics here, that you help guys get certified." Tom leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus. "The program is still getting set up, but we're taking our first class of students next month. 20 veterans, 8 weeks of intensive training, certification exams covered. We partner with local dealerships and repair shops for job placement." Marcus's eyes widened. "I'd do anything to be part of that." "It's not a handout," Tom said. "You'll work hard, 6 days a week, 8 hours a day. But at the end, you'll have certifications that will open doors. And we help with housing during the program." "When do I start?" Marcus asked. That conversation became a turning point for Tom. Marcus was the first veteran he personally recruited into the program, and watching the young man's transformation over the following weeks reminded Tom why he'd started the foundation in the first place. Jerry Henderson proved invaluable in developing the training curriculum. His decades of experience with military vehicles translated perfectly into teaching practical mechanical skills. He had a gift for breaking down complex problems into manageable steps, and his patience with struggling students was endless. "These kids remind me of myself when I came back from Vietnam," Jerry told Tom one evening as they watched their first class of students working on various projects. "Lost, angry, not sure where they fit in, but they've got skills. They just need someone to believe in them." The program attracted attention from local media. A reporter from the Richmond Times-Dispatch spent a week documenting the Foundation's work, interviewing Tom, the instructors, and the veterans going through training. The resulting article, published in November, brought a wave of donations and volunteer applications. But with growth came challenges. Tom found himself navigating bureaucratic requirements he'd never anticipated: insurance policies, liability concerns, certification standards, partnership agreements with businesses. David Morrison, Patricia's husband, became an unofficial advisor, helping Tom understand the financial and legal aspects of running a nonprofit organization. "You need a proper board of directors," David explained during one of their meetings. "Right now, everything runs through you, which means if something happens to you, the foundation falls apart. You need structure, accountability, long-term planning." Tom assembled a board that included Jerry, Patricia, David, a retired Marine Corps colonel named Rebecca Torres, who had experience with veteran advocacy groups, and a local business owner named Frank Chen, who had built a successful construction company and wanted to give back to the veteran community. Their first official board meeting took place in December, in a rented office space that would become the Foundation's administrative headquarters. Tom felt out of his depth as they discussed bylaws, mission statements, and 5-year strategic plans. But Rebecca, sensing his discomfort, pulled him aside during a break. "You're doing exactly what you should be doing," she said. "You found a need, and you're filling it. Don't let the bureaucracy make you forget why you started this." "I just want to help people," Tom admitted. "All this paperwork and planning, it feels like I'm getting further from that." "The paperwork ensures you can keep helping people for years to come," Rebecca replied. "Lieutenant Colonel Hartley planned ahead. He didn't just hide those artifacts randomly. He documented everything, protected them properly, left instructions. That's why his plan worked 40 years later. You need to think the same way." Her words resonated with Tom. He began to see the administrative work not as a distraction, but as a foundation, literally and figuratively, for sustainable impact. The first class of 20 veterans graduated in January. 19 of them secured jobs within 2 weeks. Marcus Webb was hired by a Toyota dealership with a starting salary that allowed him to rent his own apartment. At the graduation ceremony, held in Jerry's workshop, Marcus gave a speech that left few dry eyes in the room. 6 months ago, I was sleeping in a shelter, wondering if I'd made a mistake leaving the Marines," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his emotion. "I felt like I'd lost my purpose, like the skills I'd learned didn't matter anymore. This program didn't just teach me how to fix cars. It taught me that I still have value, that my service wasn't the end of my story, just a chapter." Tom stood in the back of the room, watching 20 veterans in matching blue coveralls receive their certificates. Sarah stood beside him, squeezing his hand. "You did this, Dad," she whispered. "Lieutenant Colonel Hartley did this," Tom replied. "I'm just following through." But Sarah shook her head. "He left a map. You built a bridge." As winter turned to spring, the Foundation expanded its services. They added a counseling component, partnering with the Veterans Affairs Office to provide mental health support. Tom hired a full-time counselor, Dr. Linda Vasquez, a clinical psychologist who specialized in PTSD and transition issues. "The mechanical training is crucial," Dr. Vasquez explained to the board during a March meeting. "But many of these veterans are carrying trauma. They need space to process their experiences, to understand that struggling doesn't mean they're weak." Tom thought about his own struggles after leaving the military, the shame he'd felt about finding civilian life so difficult. "I wish I'd had access to something like this when I got out." "That's exactly why we need to offer it now," Dr. Vasquez said. "Break the cycle. Show these veterans that asking for help is strength, not weakness." The Foundation's reputation spread beyond Virginia. Tom started receiving calls from veterans in neighboring states, people who had heard about the program and wanted to know if they could participate. By April, they had a waiting list of over 100 applicants. Patricia Morrison's book about her father was published in May. She organized a launch event at a bookstore in Fredericksburg and insisted that Tom be there. The turnout surprised them both, more than 100 people crowding into the small space. During the question and answer session, a woman in her 70s raised her hand. "I served as a nurse in Vietnam. I've spent my whole life wondering if any of it mattered, if we made any difference. Hearing about what Lieutenant Colonel Hartley did, how his actions are still helping people today, it gives me hope that maybe our service did mean something." Patricia's voice trembled as she responded. "My father carried guilt about the war for his entire life. He never talked about it, but I could see it in his eyes. I think protecting those artifacts was his way of trying to create something positive from a painful experience. And now, through Tom's foundation, that positive impact is multiplying." After the event, Tom and Patricia walked to a nearby park. The evening air was warm, filled with the scent of blooming flowers. They sat on a bench overlooking the Rappahannock River, watching the water reflect the fading sunlight. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd just kept the map to yourself?" Patricia asked. Tom had thought about this many times. "Yeah, and I know exactly what would have happened. I'd have ended up with a lot of money and a lot of guilt. I couldn't have lived with myself." "My father would have liked you," Patricia said quietly. "You understand honor the way he did, not as an abstract concept, but as something you live every day." The Foundation celebrated its first anniversary in June with an open house. Over 300 people attended, including 70 veterans who had completed the program, their family members, donors, and community partners. Tom gave a brief speech, thanking everyone who had made the work possible. But the most powerful moment came when Jerry Henderson stepped up to the microphone, unplanned. "I'm 73 years old," Jerry began, his voice carrying across the crowded room. "I came back from Vietnam 50 years ago, and for most of that time I felt alone. Other veterans felt alone. We didn't talk about our experiences. We didn't ask for help. We just tried to push through. He paused, looking at Tom. This foundation is changing that. It's creating community. It's showing veterans that we don't have to face our struggles alone. Tom Mitchell took a $400 gamble on an old Jeep, and look what it's become. This isn't just about job training. It's about healing, about connection, about purpose. And I'm honored to be part of it. The applause was thunderous. Tom felt tears streaming down his face, not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude. He looked around the room at all these lives intersecting, all these stories connecting. He thought about Lieutenant Colonel Hartley, about the chain of choices and chances that had led to this moment. Sarah approached him as the crowd began to disperse. She was preparing to start graduate school in the fall, having been accepted into a competitive social work program at the University of Virginia. I've been thinking about my thesis topic, she said. I want to study the effectiveness of peer support programs for veterans. Use your foundation as a case study. Tom smiled. You'd have my full cooperation. But you should know we're still figuring things out as we go. That's what makes it interesting, Sarah replied. You're building something new, something that addresses needs the traditional systems haven't met. As summer progressed, Tom received an unexpected call from a producer at a national news network. They wanted to do a feature story on the foundation, focusing on the unusual origin story and the impact the program was having on veterans' lives. Tom was hesitant. He'd never sought publicity and worried that media attention might distort the foundation's mission. But after discussing it with the board, they agreed it could help raise awareness and attract additional resources. The news crew spent 3 days filming at the foundation, interviewing veterans, capturing training sessions, and documenting the personal stories of transformation. They also traveled to the Blue Ridge Mountains to film the location where the cache had been discovered. When the segment aired in August, it reached millions of viewers. The foundation's website crashed from the traffic surge. Donations poured in from across the country. Tom's phone rang constantly with calls from other veterans organizations, wanting to learn about replicating the model, from businesses offering partnership opportunities, from politicians wanting to support the work. The attention was overwhelming. Tom found himself pulled in dozens of directions, and for a few weeks, he felt that sense of losing control, of drifting away from the hands-on work that had initially driven him. It was Marcus Webb who helped him regain perspective. Marcus had not only completed the program, but had been hired by the foundation as an assistant instructor, working with Jerry to train new students. You look stressed, Marcus observed one afternoon as he found Tom in the office, surrounded by paperwork and phone messages. I'm drowning, Tom admitted. I didn't sign up for all this administrative work. I just wanted to help veterans. Marcus pulled up a chair. You know what you told me when we first met? You said the program wasn't a handout, that I'd have to work hard. Well, this is you working hard. Not the way you expected, maybe, but it's still the work. I feel like I'm losing touch with the actual mission. Then delegate, Marcus said simply. You've got a great team. Let them handle the stuff you don't need to do personally. Save your energy for what matters most to you. Tom took Marcus's advice. He hired an executive director, a former Marine officer named Jennifer Chen, who had experience running nonprofit organizations. She took over the day-to-day operations, freeing Tom to focus on program development and direct work with veterans. The change was immediate and profound. Tom felt himself breathing easier, sleeping better, reconnecting with the purpose that had started everything. In September, the foundation launched a second program focused on teaching technology skills. The world was changing rapidly, and many veterans needed training in areas beyond mechanical work. They partnered with a local community college to offer courses in computer repair, network administration, and basic programming. Tom also established a scholarship fund for veterans who wanted to pursue higher education. Remembering his own struggles to afford Sarah's tuition, he wanted to ensure that financial barriers didn't prevent veterans from achieving their educational goals. By October, the foundation had helped over 400 veterans find employment or educational opportunities. The success rate was remarkable, with 85% of program graduates securing stable positions within 30 days of completion. But Tom knew that numbers didn't tell the whole story. The real impact was in the individual transformations, the personal victories, the moments when someone who had felt lost found their way again. He thought about this one evening as he sat in his garage working on the old military Jeep. The vehicle had become a kind of meditation for him, a place where he could think clearly, process his experiences, reconnect with himself. The Jeep had needed a new transmission, and Tom had spent the past month rebuilding it from the ground up. The work was meticulous, requiring patience and precision, but he found peace in it. Each bolt tightened, each component aligned properly, felt like a small victory. As he worked, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here, the randomness of stopping at Jerry's military surplus that particular Saturday, the impulse to buy a vehicle he didn't really need, the decision to clean under the seat. Each choice had seemed insignificant at the time, but together they had redirected the course of his life entirely. He thought about the alternative timeline, the version of his life where he'd walked past that Jeep, where he'd never found the map. He'd still be working as a security guard, struggling to make ends meet, feeling purposeless and disconnected. Sarah would have finished school, probably, but with significant debt. He'd have continued drifting, waiting for something to change. Instead, he was here, in a garage he owned, working on a vehicle that had transformed his life, running a foundation that was helping hundreds of people find their way. The improbability of it all sometimes took his breath away. Tom finished installing the new transmission as darkness fell outside. He wiped his hands on a shop towel and stepped back to admire his work. The Jeep looked better now than it probably had in decades, fully restored and functional, a testament to what could be achieved with patience and care. He thought about Lieutenant Colonel Hartley, and about the letter he'd left with his hidden cash. The man had trusted that whoever found his carefully protected treasures would do the right thing. That trust, placed in an unknown future person, had been validated. Tom had honored it, and in doing so had honored himself and his own sense of duty. The foundation wasn't just about job training or financial assistance. It was about restoring something more fundamental: dignity, purpose, community, hope. It was about showing veterans that their service had value, that their skills mattered, that they belonged. Tom locked up the garage and walked into his house, feeling the satisfying fatigue of a day well spent. Tomorrow, he would meet with 3 new veterans starting the program, would review partnership proposals with 2 potential employers, would check in with Dr. Vasquez about expanding the counseling services. But tonight, he would call Sarah, who was thriving in graduate school, conducting research that would help improve services for veterans nationwide. He would call Jerry, who at 73 had found renewed purpose in teaching and mentoring. He would send a message to Patricia Morrison, updating her on the Foundation's progress and thanking her again for trusting him with her father's legacy. And he would spend a few moments looking at the old map, now framed and hanging in his office, a reminder of where the journey had started and how far it had come. The paper was yellowed and fragile, the ink faded, but the message it carried remained clear. Trust, honor, service, sacrifice. These weren't just words. They were principles to live by, values that connected generations of people who had chosen to serve something larger than themselves. The following November marked 2 years since Tom had purchased the Jeep. The Foundation had grown beyond anything he'd imagined possible. They now had satellite programs in 3 other Virginia cities, with plans to expand into Maryland and North Carolina by the following spring. The mechanical training program had evolved to include specialized tracks in diesel mechanics, heavy equipment operation, and even aircraft maintenance, partnering with regional airports and aviation companies. Tom sat in his office on a cold Tuesday morning, reviewing applications for the next training cohort. Each file represented a story, a struggle, a person seeking a second chance. He read through them carefully, knowing that acceptance into the program could be life-changing. One application caught his attention. The veteran's name was Daniel Rodriguez, a former Army sergeant who had served 3 tours in Iraq. His story was painfully familiar. Honorable discharge, difficulty adjusting to civilian life, a marriage that had fallen apart under the strain, estrangement from his 2 young children. What made Tom pause was a handwritten note at the bottom of the application. "I don't know if I deserve another chance," Daniel had written. "I've made a lot of mistakes since I got out, but I'm trying to rebuild my life, trying to be the father my kids deserve. I heard about your program from another veteran at a support group meeting. He said you helped him when nobody else would. I'm asking for that same chance." Tom picked up his phone and dialed the number on the application. A man answered on the second ring, his voice cautious. "This is Tom Mitchell from the Veterans Foundation. Am I speaking with Daniel Rodriguez?" There was a pause. "Yes, sir. Is this about my application?" "It is. I'd like to meet with you. Are you available tomorrow afternoon?" The relief in Daniel's voice was palpable. "Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." They met at a coffee shop near the Foundation's headquarters. Daniel arrived 15 minutes early, wearing clean jeans and a button-down shirt, his hair neatly trimmed. Tom could see the effort he'd put into making a good impression, and it reminded him of his own desperation 2 years earlier. They talked for over an hour. Daniel opened up about his struggles with anger management, the nightmares that still woke him most nights, the guilt he carried about missing his children's lives. He'd been working construction jobs when he could find them, but the inconsistent income made it impossible to afford a decent apartment or catch up on child support payments. "I'm not making excuses," Daniel said. "I know I messed up, but I want to fix it. I want my kids to be proud of me again." Tom saw genuine determination in Daniel's eyes. "The program is intense, 8 weeks, 6 days a week. You'll be pushed physically and mentally. We'll help you work through the trauma, but you have to be willing to do the work." "I'm ready," Daniel said without hesitation. Tom accepted him into the next cohort, which would begin in 2 weeks. As they parted ways, Tom felt that familiar sense of purpose, the knowledge that he was doing exactly what he was meant to be doing. The winter months were busy. Tom spent time visiting the satellite programs, ensuring they maintained the same standards and values as the original Richmond location. In each city, he met veterans whose lives had been transformed by the training and support they'd received. In Norfolk, he met a woman named Angela Martinez, a former Navy medic who had struggled with PTSD after treating casualties during her deployment. She'd completed the mechanical training program 6 months earlier and was now working as a service advisor at a Honda dealership. More importantly, she'd found community and purpose again. "I thought I was broken," Angela told Tom during his visit. "I thought the best part of my life was behind me. This program showed me that wasn't true. I'm not just surviving anymore, I'm actually living." Stories like Angela's kept Tom motivated through the difficult days, the bureaucratic challenges, the inevitable setbacks that came with running a growing organization. Sarah visited home for Thanksgiving, bringing her boyfriend, Michael, a fellow graduate student she'd been dating for 6 months. Over dinner, she shared exciting news about her research. "My preliminary findings are remarkable, Dad," she said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Veterans who go through peer-based support programs like yours show significantly better outcomes than those who only use traditional VA services. Better employment rates, better mental health indicators, stronger social connections. Your model works." Tom felt proud, not just of Sarah's accomplishment, but of the validation that the Foundation's approach was making a real difference. "When will you publish?" "I'm presenting at a national social work conference in March. After that, I'll submit to academic journals. This could influence policy, Dad. Other organizations could adopt your model nationwide." The recognition was gratifying, but Tom remained focused on the individual lives rather than the broader impact. Each veteran who walked through the Foundation's doors was a person, not a statistic, and he was determined to keep that perspective no matter how large the organization grew. December brought unexpected challenges. One of the veterans in the current training cohort, a young man named Tyler Anderson, was arrested for assault after getting into a fight at a bar. The incident made local news, and critics questioned whether the Foundation was properly vetting participants or providing adequate supervision. Tom visited Tyler in jail, listening to his side of the story. Tyler had been defending a friend who was being harassed by a drunk patron. The situation had escalated and Tyler's combat training had taken over. He'd used more force than necessary, and now he was facing charges that could send him to prison. "I ruined everything," Tyler said, his head in his hands. "I finally had a chance to get my life together, and I threw it away." Tom didn't condone what Tyler had done, but he understood the struggle. The transition from military to civilian life meant relearning how to handle conflict, how to control responses that had been necessary in combat but were inappropriate at home. "The Foundation will support you through this," Tom said. "We'll help you get a good lawyer, and we'll testify about your progress in the program if it helps. But you have to take responsibility for your actions. You have to do the work to make sure this never happens again." The case was eventually resolved with a plea deal: probation, anger management classes, and community service. Tyler completed his training program and found employment, but the incident served as a wake-up call for the Foundation. They expanded their counseling services, adding group therapy sessions focused specifically on anger management and conflict resolution. Dr. Vasquez took the lead on developing the new curriculum. "We can't just teach these veterans job skills," she explained to the board. "We have to help them reintegrate into society in every way. That means teaching them how to handle stress, how to process emotions, how to navigate civilian social situations." The enhanced program proved effective. Over the following months, they saw fewer incidents and better overall outcomes for participants. Daniel Rodriguez thrived in the training program. He showed natural mechanical aptitude and quickly became one of the top students in his cohort. More importantly, he engaged fully with the counseling services, working through his trauma and learning healthier coping mechanisms. Marcus Webb, now a full-time instructor, took Daniel under his wing. The two men bonded over their shared experiences, and Marcus became a mentor and friend. "You remind me of myself a year ago," Marcus told Daniel one afternoon as they worked on rebuilding an engine together. "Lost, angry, desperate for a second chance. You're going to make it. I can see it." "How do you know?" Daniel asked. "Because you're here. Because you're doing the work. That's all it takes, man. Just keep showing up, keep trying, keep moving forward." In January, Daniel graduated with his certification. His ex-wife attended the ceremony with their 2 children, ages 7 and 9. Tom watched as Daniel knelt down to hug his kids, tears streaming down his face. The children clung to him, and his ex-wife smiled, perhaps seeing hope for the first time in years that their father could be a stable presence in their lives. After the ceremony, Daniel's ex-wife approached Tom. "Thank you," she said simply. "I didn't think we'd ever get him back, but I can see the change. He's getting help, he's trying. That's all I ever wanted." Daniel secured a job at a Ford dealership with a salary that allowed him to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. He set up the second bedroom for his children, and within a month, he had regular visitation. The child support payments resumed, and slowly, painfully, he began rebuilding trust with his family. Tom added Daniel's story to the mental collection he kept, the reminders of why the work mattered. Every graduation, every job placement, every family reunion was a small victory against the isolation and desperation that so many veterans faced. The Foundation's second anniversary celebration in March was larger than the first. Over 500 people attended, including representatives from the Department of Veterans Affairs, state legislators, and media from across the region. Sarah presented her research findings, and the response was enthusiastic. Several politicians approached Tom after Sarah's presentation, expressing interest in supporting legislation that would provide state funding for programs modeled after his foundation. Tom was cautious, knowing that government involvement could bring both resources and restrictions, but he agreed to participate in discussions about how to scale the model effectively. Patricia Morrison attended the celebration with her husband. She'd become a regular presence at Foundation events, serving on the advisory board and using her father's story to help raise awareness and funds. "Dad would be so proud," she told Tom, as they watched veterans and their families mingling in the crowded hall. "Not just of what you've built, but of how you've built it, with integrity, with respect for the people you're serving." "I think about him often," Tom admitted. "I wonder what he was like, what drove him to protect those artifacts for so long." "He was a lot like you," Patricia said. "Quiet, determined, more comfortable doing the work than talking about it. He believed in serving something larger than himself. That's why his final message resonated with you so strongly. You two were cut from the same cloth." As spring arrived, Tom found himself reflecting on the transformation of his own life. 2 years earlier, he'd been a struggling security guard, divorced, barely making ends meet, feeling disconnected from any sense of purpose. Now he was running a thriving organization, reconnecting with his daughter, making a tangible difference in people's lives. But success brought its own challenges. The Foundation's growth meant more administrative demands, more time spent in meetings and dealing with bureaucracy, less time working directly with veterans. Tom hired additional staff to handle operations, but he made a conscious decision to remain involved in the training programs, teaching classes, and mentoring students personally. "You don't have to do this," Jennifer Chen, the executive director, told him one afternoon. "We have excellent instructors. You could focus entirely on strategic leadership." "I know," Tom replied, "but this is why I started the Foundation. If I lose touch with the veterans, if I become just another administrator, then I've lost the heart of what we're doing." Jerry Henderson, now 74, continued teaching despite occasional health concerns. He'd become something of a legend among the veterans, a wise elder who understood their struggles and believed in their potential. One afternoon in April, Jerry pulled Tom aside after a training session. "I need to talk to you about something." They walked outside, standing in the parking lot where Tom had first seen the old military Jeep 2 years earlier. Jerry looked tired, his face more lined than Tom remembered. "The doctors found something," Jerry said quietly. "Cancer, prostate. They caught it early, so the prognosis is good, but I'm going to need surgery and probably some radiation treatment." Tom felt his stomach drop. "Whatever you need, take as much time as you need. The Foundation will cover all your medical expenses." Jerry shook his head. "That's not what I'm worried about. I'm worried about letting down these kids. They need consistency. They need someone who understands them." "They need you healthy," Tom said firmly. "We'll manage. Marcus can take over your classes temporarily, and we'll bring in another instructor if needed. You focus on getting better." Jerry's surgery was scheduled for May. The veterans in the current training cohort organized a Get Well event, presenting Jerry with cards and messages, expressing how much his teaching had meant to them. Jerry broke down crying, overwhelmed by the outpouring of affection and respect. "I spent 50 years thinking nobody cared what I'd been through," Jerry said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thinking my service didn't matter, that I was just another forgotten veteran. You all have given me more than I've given you. You've given me family." The surgery went well, and Jerry's recovery progressed smoothly. By June, he was back teaching part-time, though Tom and Jennifer insisted he take it easy and delegate more responsibilities to Marcus and the other instructors. Summer brought new opportunities and challenges. The Foundation received a significant grant from a national philanthropic organization, providing funds to expand into 3 new states and develop specialized programs for female veterans and those with disabilities. Tom hired a director of expansion, a former Army officer named Robert Hayes, to oversee the new locations. Robert had experience with nonprofit management and a passion for veteran services, making him ideal for the role. The expansion required careful planning. Each new location needed qualified instructors, partnerships with local businesses, connections with VA offices and other veteran service organizations. Tom traveled extensively, meeting with potential partners and community leaders, ensuring each new program would maintain the standards and values of the original. In Charlotte, North Carolina, Tom met with the owner of a large automotive repair chain who wanted to partner with the foundation. The man, Richard Thompson, was himself a veteran who had built his business from a single garage into a regional success. "I remember what it was like coming home," Richard said over lunch. "Nobody wanted to hire a veteran. They thought we were damaged goods, that we'd be unreliable or violent. I want to be part of changing that narrative." They worked out an agreement where Richard's company would provide job placement for program graduates and offer additional on-the-job training. It was exactly the kind of partnership the foundation needed to succeed in new markets. Sarah completed her graduate degree in June and was immediately hired by a national veterans advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. The position would allow her to influence policy at the federal level, bringing research and evidence-based practices to discussions about how to better serve veterans. "I learned everything from watching you, Dad," Sarah told Tom during a celebration dinner after her graduation. "You showed me that real change happens one person at a time, but that individual change can scale into something bigger." Michael, her boyfriend, had proposed in May, and they were planning a small wedding for the following spring. Tom liked Michael, appreciated how he supported Sarah's passion and ambitions, how he treated her with respect and kindness. As Tom watched his daughter planning her future, building a career dedicated to service, he felt immense pride. She'd taken the lessons from his journey and amplified them, creating her own path while honoring the values he'd tried to instill. The Foundation's third training facility opened in July in Baltimore, Maryland. The ribbon-cutting ceremony attracted local media attention and the participation of several city officials. Tom gave a brief speech emphasizing the Foundation's mission and thanking the community partners who had made the expansion possible. After the ceremony, a reporter approached him with a question that caught Tom off guard. "Mr. Mitchell, you've built something remarkable here, transforming a lucky find into an organization that's helped thousands of veterans. But some critics say you're perpetuating the narrative that veterans need charity, that they're broken and need fixing. How do you respond to that?" Tom considered the question carefully. "I don't think veterans are broken. I think our system for supporting them is broken. These men and women have skills, dedication, and a work ethic that's second to none. What they need isn't charity, it's opportunity, support, and community. That's what we provide. We're not fixing people. We're opening doors that should have been open all along." The reporter nodded, scribbling notes. "And the money from the cash? Do you ever regret not keeping more of it for yourself?" Tom smiled. "Every dollar I have came from a choice to do the right thing. Lieutenant Colonel Hartley trusted whoever found his cash to honor his intentions. I honored that trust, and the rewards have been far greater than any amount of money could provide. I have purpose, community, the satisfaction of knowing I'm making a difference. That's worth more than any bank account." The article that ran the following week was favorable, highlighting the Foundation's work and Tom's philosophy of service. It generated additional donations and volunteer applications, helping to support the continued expansion. By August, the Foundation was operating in 6 cities across 3 states, serving over 200 veterans simultaneously in various training programs. The staff had grown to 40 full-time employees and over 100 volunteers. The annual budget exceeded $3 million, all funded through donations, grants, and partnerships. Tom sat in his office late one evening, reviewing quarterly reports and planning documents. The numbers were impressive, but he kept coming back to the individual stories, the personal transformations that gave meaning to all the statistics. He thought about Marcus Webb, who had gone from homeless and hopeless to being a respected instructor and mentor, about Daniel Rodriguez, who was rebuilding his relationship with his children and creating a stable life, about Angela Martinez and the hundreds of other veterans who had found their way through the program. He thought about Jerry Henderson, recovering from cancer and still teaching despite his age and health challenges, driven by a commitment to help others avoid the isolation he'd experienced for so many years. He thought about Sarah, using her education and passion to advocate for veterans at the highest levels of policymaking. And he thought about Lieutenant Colonel James Hartley, a man he'd never met but whose final act of service had set all of this in motion. The trust Hartley had placed in an unknown future, the careful planning and protection of valuable artifacts, the hope that someone would honor his intentions. Tom pulled out his phone and called Patricia Morrison. She answered quickly, her voice warm. "Tom, how are you? I saw the article about the Baltimore opening. Congratulations." "Thank you. I was just sitting here thinking about your father, about everything that's happened because of his decision to hide that cashier and leave that map." There was a pause. "He would be amazed, I think, and deeply moved. He spent his whole life carrying guilt about things he couldn't control or change. If he could see what's come from his final act, the ripples spreading out from that one choice, I think it would bring him peace." They talked for another 20 minutes, sharing updates and reflections. When Tom finally hung up, he felt renewed energy and purpose. The work was far from finished. There were thousands more veterans who needed support, new challenges to address, new opportunities to seize. Tom locked up his office and walked out to his car. The old military Jeep sat in its usual spot in the parking lot, fully restored and maintained, still reliable after all these years. He ran his hand along the hood, feeling the cool metal under his palm, remembering that March afternoon 2 years earlier when he'd first seen it. $400. A random impulse, a simple decision to clean under a seat. Such small moments, such insignificant choices at the time, but they had changed everything. Tom drove home through the quiet streets of Richmond, thinking about the nature of service and sacrifice, about how one person's actions can echo across time and touch lives they'll never meet. Lieutenant Colonel Hartley had protected those artifacts for over 40 years, trusting in a future he'd never see. Tom was honoring that trust, extending that chain of service into a new generation. And somewhere, he liked to think, other people were making their own small choices, taking their own chances, trusting their own instincts. Each decision, each action, creating ripples that would spread outward in ways they couldn't imagine. That was the real treasure he'd found. Not the money, but the understanding that every life connects to others, that service creates more service, that trust honored becomes trust extended. Lieutenant Colonel Hartley had left more than a map and a cache of valuable artifacts. He'd left a legacy of honor, and Tom was committed to carrying that legacy forward for as long as he was able. And every time Tom drove that old military Jeep down the winding roads of Virginia, he felt connected to something larger than himself, part of a chain of service and sacrifice that stretched backward through generations and forward into a future he was helping to build, one veteran at a time.